Thank you for joining us today on the At the Table podcast, where I strive to encourage and equip you on your journey to know and follow Jesus Christ. This week on the At the Table podcast, we're going to look back at last week's message, Daniel in Exile. We're going to look ahead to this week's message, A Return Home. And I'm going to share from a devotional I shared at a recent men's outing on 1 Peter. Without further ado, let's get started. Last week we looked at this message, Daniel in Exile. The two kingdoms, the divided kingdoms, the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel had both been defeated, and the people had been taken off into exile. And the book of Daniel looks at this from a very unique perspective. It looks at from the life of Daniel and three of his friends who you may know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And in this first half of Daniel, we see this account of what happened in Daniel's life throughout this exile. In the message, we talked about how Babylon was taking the Israelite people and exiling them back to Babylon. See, the southern kingdom had actually been sieged 3 different times by the king Nebuchadnezzar before it finally fell and the temple was destroyed. Daniel was born actually during King Josiah's reign, which it was a good time for the southern kingdom that was short-lived. Good times followed as Josiah led the people before the Lord. But as we mentioned, this ended and it brought harsh times because the people of Israel did not follow God. Well, Nebuchadnezzar came in the first time and took some exiles out in 605. And this is where we likely believe that Daniel was taken out with the other members, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, otherwise known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then we took a look at how there was 3 stories in the book of Daniel that involved Daniel or those 3 other men, and how this showed us a tremendous understanding of God's sovereignty working in the midst of these trials. And we looked at 3 questions. The first was, does your diet match God's diet? And we looked at the story in Daniel chapter 1 and where Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were all brought in and they were given a different diet, but they stood up to that diet because they realized it was against God's diet for their life. And they asked if they could try God's diet and then compare how they did versus the others. And lo and behold, by being faithful to God, he honored that, and they were able to show tremendous favor with the Babylonians, and this led to many years of service. The second thing we looked at was, is your allegiance really as strong as you think it is? See, in Daniel chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had their allegiance to God severely tested. See, there was a decree that whenever the music was played, everybody had to stop and bow down to worship the idol of Nebuchadnezzar. It was over 90 feet tall. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were near the idol at one time when the music went off, and they would not bow down. And see, the penalty from the king for not bowing down was to be thrown into the fire. And the other leaders of the day saw that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't bow down and pulled them before the king. And sure enough, the king said, listen, you need to do this or I'm going to throw you into the fire. And they said, we will not bow down to any other god. Our God is able to save us from this fire. And even if he doesn't, we still will not bow down. Well, of course, this made the king furious, as he said, fine, stoke the fire, super hot, so hot that as they were getting close, the men that were throwing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire died on the spot. But a moment later, the king goes, wait a minute, didn't we just throw 3 people in there? I see 4, and they're walking around, and they're not bound. What is going on? Well, we go on to see and learn that, in fact, God did rescue them. And because of this, Nebuchadnezzar realized that this is the one true God and made a decree about such. Well, the third question was this: how strong are your convictions? And Daniel, later on in Daniel chapter 6, had those convictions put to the test. He would pray to God regularly 3 times a day in a very public place. And this really kind of infuriated the other officials because they were looking for a way to get him in trouble. Well, they found it when they found him praying and saw him praying. And so they convinced the king at the time to put a decree out that says you cannot pray to anybody else other than him for 30 days. Well, Daniel heard this, and Daniel said, I will not pray to that. I'm going to pray to my God. And he did this in a very public way, in the same way he had done it before, in an elevated position in front of a window facing the right direction. And the people goes, I got him. And so they went before the king and said, this is what happened. This is what you said you do. Now you need to do what you said you were going to do. And the king was greatly distressed. It says he even tried to find another way to move on without punishing Daniel by throwing him in the lion's den, but he couldn't. So he throws him in there. And overnight, long story short, the lion did not eat Daniel. And so the king pulls him out, throws in the men that created this rule, and suddenly the lions were hungry and they ate and devoured and overpowered them. Well, this week, we're going to continue in God's big story. We're going to look at the story this week of the return home, and we're going to primarily be inside the book of Ezra. And in the book of Ezra, we're going to see something in the first half of the book this week, and we're going to investigate what it's like for the people of the Lord to be able to go back to their homeland and rebuild the temple. And we're going to look at this idea of why was it so important to rebuild this temple? Well, three quick answers are this: is God's passion, and the fact that the temple is a picture of God's passion to dwell among his people. The second reason is God's problem. We'll see sin separates people from him and the world from him. And because of that, there needed to be a solution. And God's solution required sacrifice at this temple, and that was where God dwelt. And so the people would go back, and they began well. But we're also going to take a look at how this construction was abandoned. The people actually abandoned it for about a decade. And so God then says, fine, I'll send a messenger, and one prophet that we'll talk about is Haggai, and he's going to give them a clear message. This is what you are to do. Continue on. And sure enough, they do continue and rebuild the temple. And finally, at the end, we're going to look at this idea that sometimes in life, God sends seasons of trial and testing. And that's exactly what this season was for these Israelites as they went back. See, they started out well, but then obstacles came up and they got distracted and they didn't keep doing what God wanted them to do. And we're going to see how not only God sends severe times of testing, but we also must remember that not all testing is a result of sin. And God also sends these trials and tests to wake us up and to exhort us to examine our ways. Because sometimes we, just like the Israelites, have forgotten our way. And then finally, we're going to look at 4 takeaways. Number 1, God calls us from the distractions that pull us from his purpose. In other words, he wants us to come back to him. Second, as a result of testing, we are pulled back to him. The people of Israel got back on track, and so might we. Thirdly, Jesus calls us to seek his kingdom first above all things. And in the fourth one is this, is the Jews, in fact, would repent, and that we must consider this same response in our own life. Well, this past week, I shared this devotional with the men that came to the men's cookout on Monday night. And let's just say we had good food. It was a wonderful time of discipleship, a wonderful time of fellowship, spending time together, enjoying each other's company, and eating some good food. But in the midst of this, I shared this brief devotional that I put together from 1 Peter. And we're specifically going to look at 3 sections. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3 through 5, verses 13 through 16, and finally in 1 Peter 2, 9 through 10. Well, let's look at the first 3 verses and read them. In 1 Peter 1, verses 3 through 5. Praise be to God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade, kept in heaven for you, who through faith are shielded by God's power until the coming of the salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time. Well, Peter starts out this letter strongly. He's giving us what I call the foundation. Jesus Christ is our foundation. It is where we find hope. It's where our faith and is able to be shielded because we place it in God's power, not our power, but in him and what he did through the person of Jesus Christ. And so my question to the men were, what is your foundation firmly built on Jesus Christ? You know, our men's group meets on Monday night, and we are working through a book called The Discipleship for Design, or Design for Discipleship. And we're in first book right now talking about the foundation, who is Jesus Christ, and what that means to our lives. So if you've never used this study before, or if you want to start coming to the men's group, men, I encourage you to do so. And we're going to be diving deep and learning how to better follow Jesus Christ. The second passage is from 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 13 through 16. Therefore, verse 13, therefore prepare your minds for action, for be self-controlled. Set your hope fully on the grace to be given you when Jesus Christ is revealed. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, be holy because I am holy. Well, in these verses, we see that our foundation, yes, is Jesus, but we're also called to action. We're also called to live a life after Jesus. You know, so many times we think that we believe and that's all we have to do. And well, believing in Jesus is what brings us to salvation. But the true matter is that if our lives are really changed, if we really understand what to the point of what Jesus has done for us, our lives will be different. These verses tell us, don't be like you used to be when you didn't know better. But now that you do, live differently. Follow Jesus. Be men, be women of action. So we see that there's a foundation in Jesus, and we are called, secondly, to an action to be like Christ. Thirdly, if we turn to chapter 2 of 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 9, we see this. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Well, in this brief two verse call here, we see that we are to be a reflection. See, we're called to the foundation of Jesus in chapter 1, verse 3 through 5. We also see that we should be men and women of action and based on chapter 1, verse 13 and 16. And finally, we see that we are to be a reflection of Jesus. There's three small points that I see in the midst of this that Peter is talking about. The first is this. As a reflection, remember that it is a privilege. We are chosen to follow Jesus, his royal priesthood, his representation, his reflection on this earth. And it is a privilege unless we not forget. Second, it is a responsibility. You know, so many times we're commanded to follow Jesus and to be his spokesperson. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, starting in verse 17, tells us we're a new creation and we are to be his message and the mission of reconciliation to the nation. It is our responsibility. And thirdly, we are to make this a priority. We are called, make this a priority in our lives. And this full reflection can be seen in the next two verses in 2 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 11. It says, "Dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in this world, so abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of wrongdoing, they may see your good deeds and your glorify God on the day he visits." We are to be a reflection of Jesus Christ in this dark world. And let me tell you, light stands out So when you stand out, when you reflect Jesus, when you live for him, you will find and run into persecution and all sorts of crazy things, because this world, see, there's only two very distinct responses to Jesus. One is rejection. The second is surrender. And when we surrender and we serve and be like Jesus, we are going to stand out and we are going to encounter rejection. But let us be such a good example that even when they press us, they try to find a reason to throw us into prison or to persecute us, they won't be able to find anything, because we are such a good reflection of Jesus. Well, I hope this message today encourages you. And if you're not a member of either our women's small group, our men's small group, or our family small group, which meets the second Sunday evening of every month, I'm strongly encouraging you to get involved, make connections, and come to these small groups. The men's and women's small group study on Monday evenings starting at 6:30. The men meet here at the church. The women meet at the house of Sue Michaels. And I encourage you strongly, if you're not a member of a small group, to get plugged in. You know, at this church, at Grace Community Church, one of our core values is family. And we view not just the nuclear family, but the church family is so critical for growing spiritually. In fact, I think it's a necessity to be attending regularly, but also being a part of a group of some kind, and then serving at this church as part of your spiritual growth. It's how God works things out. And it's in these groups that we remember we are not alone. And when trials and tribulations come, just like Daniel and his friends saw in last week, and just like the Israelites will see this week, and we look at the book of Ezra, these things are going to happen in life. They're going to come, but God will use them so oftentimes to draw us closer to him and to bring glory to his name and to see others bow down and call him king. So let us take these words of Peter with the foundation of Jesus, that we're able to live distinguished and set apart lives, and that we are to be a reflection of Jesus in our life. Well, I hope this message has encouraged and equipped you on your journey to know and follow Jesus Christ. Until next time, we'll see you later.
You have been listening to the At the Table podcast with Pastor Gary. I hope this episode has left you encouraged and equipped. Pastor Gary is the lead pastor of Grace Community Church in Alliance, Ohio. To learn more about the church, the ministries at the church, or to give to support Grace Community Church, you can follow the links in the show notes or go directly to gccofalliance.org. Have a blessed day.